Well, it might, and it also maybe already answered that,
Yeah,
you know.
I think the first one is what are the cuts, like
Yeah.
that's like what's the percentage.
What are the cuts your sector?
The next one to get into more.
So the only thing Doug,
Yeah. This isn't a test.
We're live?
or like,
Wait, 6:30? I don't trust clocks.
Good evening. My name is Douglas Judson. I'm a member of Town Council here in Fort Francis, but tonight I'm here in my capacity as a director of the Northwest Community Legal Clinic. And on behalf of the clinic, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the Fort Francis Civic Center and to thank our viewers for tuning in to our panel discussion tonight. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered tonight on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people, a region in which the Métis also share history and that they call their home. Tonight is about helping local residents understand how changes in provincial government policy and the province's budget will have an impact here in our community. Many have seen the headlines from Toronto and Queen's Park speaking about big numbers and large cut percentages, but we don't really have a full grasp of what exactly that means and how that translates to our everyday life. So tonight is about digging in to better understand what those figures mean and how they will play into our local public sector and local public services. This is intended to be a fact-based, myth-busting session to give you the real goods on the future of some of your local services. And to that end, we have established a panel of experts here from 5 different public sector organizations in our community. I will let them introduce themselves and their organizations in a moment. And tonight we'll be going through a short list of questions where they will provide you with some information. We will then, there'll be an opportunity for attendees to ask questions and to engage in a bit of a dialogue down here at this microphone, if it works tonight. Running joke. So with that, perhaps I will just start here and let our first panelist introduce himself and where he hails tonight.
Hi there. My name is Kent Kowalski. I am the OSSTF, Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation, local president.
I'm Carolyn Goulding. I'm the CEO of the Fort Francis Public Library Technology Center.
hello, I'm Dan McCormick. I'm the CEO of the Rainy River District Social Services Administration Board, and under it there are 4 programs: Ontario Works, Children's Services, Community Housing, and Paramedic Services.
I'm Trudy McCormick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Northwest Community Legal Clinic.
And I'm Christy Cousino. I'm the educator trainer, Canadian Mental Health Association, Fort Francis branch.
Thank you and welcome to our panelists, and thank you for taking time out of your evening to be here. With that, we will jump right in to our first question. And this one's pretty straightforward. What cuts will your sector be experiencing as a result of the provincial budget? And here, let's just talk specifically straight goods. What are the cuts and how do we understand them? I'll start perhaps here, move around the table.
Okay. I have something prepared.
Yes.
Shouldn't take me too long.
Absolutely.
Okay. The Doug Ford government campaign on finding $6 billion of efficiencies. To contain costs, their plan included removing over $1 billion from educational funding. To accomplish this, the provincial government altered the funding formula, changed the way it calculates funding for boards. In secondary panel, they changed the formula ratio from 22 to 1 to 28 to 1. This results in a 20% reduction in the number of teachers. The government's claim that nobody will lose their job due to the funding changes is false, as we currently have 7 people without employment in the secondary panel and 3 in the elementary panel for the next school year. The result of these cuts will be a loss of programming options at all academic levels for students and large classes for those programs that are able to run. As a reminder, we have been funded at 22 to 1 for years. And in that time, class sizes have gone as large as 31 students. Moving the funding to 28 to 1 will require class caps somewhere between 35 and 40 students, or the elimination of classes that don't contain 25 students or less. Something that has been poorly reported in the media is that funding is based on the average class size, and many comparators to other provinces have been against their class caps. If one class has only 22 students, the second must have 34 to attain an average of 28. Some classes must run with fewer students for safety reasons or in special education classes. Legislated caps for special ed is 16 students. For each special ed class that is taught, there would have to be another class in the school with at least 40 students. And that is if the special ed class was at cap. It could be lower. It is simple math. The more students in a class, the less contact time there is for a teacher to have for each student. Increased class size will affect students disproportionately, where the students that need the most assistance will have access to less help. The Doug Ford government has also implemented the requirement for each student to complete 4 compulsory e-learning credits as a condition of graduation. E-learning has been around for about a decade. However, in that time, it has never been a popular option for students because of the format of the course. Not many students have the discipline and motivation to sit in front of a computer every day where they read, interact, and learn exclusively through a computer console. Experience has shown that the completion rate of e-learning credits is far below that of traditional classes. Mandating compulsory e-learning classes may be an effective cost-cutting measure, but forcing students to take them will not serve the needs of the students in the way a classroom teacher can. Large class sizes, elimination of specialty program, compulsory e-learning, and job losses are all the direct consequence of the cost-cutting measures imposed on the education system by the Ford government. Money used in education is not a cost. It's an investment. An investment in people, an investment in the future. The cuts by the Ford government are myopic and will erode the quality of education for our students, future employees, future leaders of the province. There is a social component under funding public education. I'm fearful that every time the government attacks funding for public schools as it opens the door to an American-style private-for-profit educational system. Tax incentives, voucher programs, and private for-profit schools all erode the public education system. The Rainy River School Board is dealing with a decline in funding, and 7 teachers in the secondary panel are currently declared redundant. That's 7 people without a teaching job this September. These are the people in our community whom you might know. I would like to share their names and their classes that may be eliminated in their absence. Sherry Dragon at Atikokan High School. She's responsible for Science, Math, English, Special Ed. Tanika Norman, Fort Francis High School, English, Math, Family Studies. Tirza Keffer, Fort Francis High School, English Geography. Chris Sinclair, Fort Francis High School, Phys Ed. Gerald Arsenault, Rainy River High School, Woodshop. Kelly Agar, Rainy River High School, History, Geography, English. Stephanie Hamilton, Rainy River, History, English, Family Studies, and Native Language. These are the real people in our district who have been told by our government that they would not lose a job this fall. These are the people that are consumers of goods and services in our district. These are people who contribute to our community and our local economy. These are people lied to by the Ford government who are unemployed as of June 28th.
Thank you for that. I think some very good comparisons of different metrics that are being used to mislead some of that conversation in there. Maybe moving down the table to Caroline.
For sure. So what the library sector is experiencing with these budget cuts is a 50% reduction in funding to the Ontario Library Services. So the Ontario Library Services are 2 provincially funded agencies that support local public libraries. So there's one for the north that operates out of Sudbury and one for the south that operates out of Toronto. Both of these agencies support all Ontario public libraries through different initiatives. So for example, one of the impacts because of the funding cut that I think a lot of people would have heard about was interlibrary loan. The Southern Ontario Library Services manages the website that operates that, and it was shut down for 2 months. They've also made drastic changes to how interlibrary loan operates in the south, which has impacted the north, which I'll get into later. Where we're really feeling the cut locally is the reduction in funding to Ontario Library Services North. So because of their reduction, they've had to make some very difficult decisions around the services that they offer libraries. So one of the big major things is that we rely on them for what's called an integrated library system, or ILS. And that's the thing that lets us check books in and out. It's the thing that lets you place holds. It's the thing that lets us track fines. So we access our ILS through Ontario Library Service North. Because of the funding reduction, they've reduced support hours. So it is only being supported Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. Our hours are not Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. We've lost out on technology advising and website maintenance. There's been a reduction in the consultation services. There's less professional development events. And to get back to Kent's point as well, frontline staff have lost jobs. So half of Ontario Library Services North staff have been laid off, to the equivalent of 7 full-time positions.
Thank you for that. We'll just move down the table to Dan.
Thank you. I'm just going to touch briefly on our programs and also mention we're also watching very closely Ontario Health and the Ontario Health teams, as well as public health, because they impact directly on our services as well. And as you know, there is a proposed amalgamation between the Northwest Health Unit and the Thunder Bay District Health Unit. So right now, we can't speak very specific to cuts because we haven't been provided with detailed budgets. There's been a lot of information floating around, and there was a rollback on what was originally announced as cuts in most of our sectors. So in Ontario Works, we've been advised that their funding for the 2019 year is going to be frozen at 2018 actuals. So obviously that translates to any economic increases will be borne by the municipalities. If the caseload remains static, we should not have a problem in that area. However, there are proposed definition changes in another sector for Ontario Disability Support Program. And if that moves forward, that definition change could increase our caseload by somewhere around 40%. So obviously, if the 40% increase is there in the caseload and the money's not there to deliver the case, but we're bound by law to deliver the services, it'll be a direct impact on our local taxpayer. In children's services, currently the proposed cuts to the program have been rescinded. Initially, they were proposing an administration expense cut from 10% to 5%, and they were also looking at a cost share on enhancement of services from 100% provincial to an 80-20 provincial municipal cost share. Our first estimate of the effect of that was somewhere around $330,000 direct cost to the local municipalities, with about $115,000 in each sector. Having received our new funding guidelines just recently, last week as a matter of fact, we actually were pleasantly surprised that our funding remains intact for this fiscal year. However, all indications are that they will change it as of January 1st, 2020. On community housing, which was formerly called social housing under previous governments, our current community homelessness prevention initiative, CHIPPY, which many of you know, was increased to from $365,000 to $465,000. So one area we did not see a cut, we actually see an increase in the 2021 year, and that's frozen for the future year as well. Close to $100,000 increase, so a little more positive. However, noting what the commitment we had in writing previously, that's actually a cut of $100,000, what we were expecting. The province has also advised us of 2 new programs, Canada-Ontario Community Housing Initiative, called COCHI, and we are going to receive about $207,000 in 2021, but that program is obviously not up and running yet. And the other program is the Ontario Priorities Housing Initiative, which will see $137,000 this year, $71,000 next year, and $110,000 in 21-22. Now, just to say, the one program is a direct offset, as are buildings which were basically debentured by the province come due or at the end of their agreements, the money is being reinvested by the feds. So it's actually flow-through funding, not provincial funding. The last area, of course, is paramedic services, and currently there's a lot of misinformation out there. The government has committed to reducing the number of our dispatch centers from 22 to 10, and while we won't see a direct influence in our district, we know that the Kenora district has a very good chance of losing that dispatch center and it moving to Thunder Bay. We're also looking at providing better patient response with algorithms under our dispatch center. That is still moving forward. Although there is no current plan to amalgamate ambulance services, they are consulting with us currently on the treatment and release of patients. That's where we could treat a patient at the scene and actually release them from care without bringing them to the hospital. The second aspect we're looking at is alternative destinations. So you've heard the hallway healthcare system, they want to stop that. This is an area where we could actually take a patient directly to an addiction center or to CMHA, depending on the various agreements. The issue we have right now, and again, this is one area that we're really in the dark about, is they indicated our funding would be frozen at 2018 levels, which is actually 2017 budget figures. We're waiting to see how that plays out because the Premier did announce there wouldn't be a freeze, but we have yet to receive funding letters. In ambulance, we received 3 shares of funding. One is based on a 50-50 cost share with the municipalities, and the other are 100% provincial, which is our townships without municipal organization and our First Nations funding. So we're waiting to see. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing that uncertainty that creates when you don't have the figures as well. Trudy, over to you.
Thank you. As I've been to council and been in the media, Legal Aid Ontario received a reduction to their budget of almost 35% in the provincial budget in April, and the cut to their overall funding was $133 million. We waited until, we didn't get our budget until last Wednesday for this fiscal year, and our budget, the community legal clinic budgets all saw cuts. This year's cuts, the direct cuts, were not as drastic for our area as they were for a lot of people. The cut to the budget itself is pretty minor, it's 1.5%. But then you have to look at the details that come with that, as always. And in addition to the cut to the budget, there's a list of items that were funded previously by legal aid, and we now have to find money for within our reduced budget. So although in political speak they weren't a direct cut, they're no longer funded, so we now have to find money for them. The bigger picture, we rely on what we call specialty clinics, legal clinics who do work in specialized areas of law to help us be able to do really complex cases in our communities. And those clinics received huge cuts. They received cuts on the level of 20 to 30%. One clinic was even cut 45%. So those clinics are no longer going to be able to support the geographic clinics throughout the province. So for example, we won't have much ability to take on workers' compensation files because they're very complex, they're very specific, and until now we would have gotten help from those clinics to be able to do that. Another thing that has happened with our funding is that a lot of the central supports that we used to receive are completely gone. We had learning and training in the legal profession. We're required to do continuing professional development. And generally there aren't other lawyers who do our type of work. We do something that's a very narrow specialty. That's called poverty law. And we called it clinic learning and training. The budget for that was cut in half 5 or 6 years ago, so we had operated with half the funds that we had before to provide learning and training to 72 clinics throughout the province. That budget has now been completely eliminated. So we are also going to have to find ways to meet our professional obligations, get that continuing education, and spread that throughout the entire province. The biggest piece that's coming right now is that there was a report, Legal Aid Ontario was part of the Provincial Auditor General's report that was released last December. And in that report, there was a recommendation that a review be done of community legal clinics and the community clinic model. That review is now underway, and it's become a larger thing. It's of legal aid as a whole, and they're now calling it the Legal Aid Modernization Project. And it seems that the end result, the end goal of this modernization project is to eliminate community boards of directors, to eliminate legal clinics as local community organizations. So for example, our legal clinic, we have a 10-member board of directors, and they're all drawn from the communities that we work in. And if things play out the way they currently appear they're going, those boards may be gone by the end of March, because the review is supposed to wrap up by March 31st, but in the terms of reference, both the Ministry of the Attorney General and Legal Aid Ontario have the authority to make changes immediately without completing the report and the review if they decide that they want to make changes. The other piece that goes along with that is we've currently been directed not to engage in law reform work and in community development work, which was a big part of the community legal clinic model. All the presentations, the things we get involved in the community, the homelessness efforts, those to us are community development, and this government has directed that our priority is just to purely be direct client service, individual client files, which is really unfortunate because it's those larger initiatives that actually lead to change, that lead to changing laws, changing policies. And for example, if as Dan mentioned, Ontario Disability Support Program rules are going to change, if clinics aren't allowed as a group to try and work through that and represent clients and make sure it turns out well for people, then we're going to have a lot less ability and a lot less oomph to help people around the province.
Thank you, Trudy.
CMHA Fort Frances is fortunate we will not be experiencing any cuts with the upcoming budget. Mental health and addiction is forecasted to receive additional funding, and Fort Frances is going to be receiving 2 subsidies with our court program in release and custody. CMHA Fort Frances is here to give a view as to how this will affect our clients and what this means for the marginalized people in our community and throughout the district.
Great. Thank you, Christy. So we've gotten a bit of a taste of what the budgetary framework looks like for each of these service areas from those earlier remarks, and thank you for providing them. Let's drill down a little bit further and try to give those watching at home, those in the gallery, a flavor for what it may mean for their on-the-street experience of the service you provide. Now, I know we actually have this broken down into 2 questions, but I'm actually thinking we could probably efficiently answer them together. The first question was, how might these changes impact service delivery? And the second one was, what might the community experience as a result of those impacts? And I think really what we're getting at here is, what is the impact here if you're a person who relies on these services? What changes are you maybe going to experience or what difference as a result? So perhaps we'll go around again and give everyone a chance to weigh in on that local impact element of the discussion.
Do you want me to answer the second and third question together, or we'll just do 2?
If you can, it's up to you.
I can roll with it.
Yeah.
Okay. So how might these changes impact service delivery? Well, teachers teach, and that will continue. Now, with less teachers, there will be less course offerings. Many students will not get the classes of their choice, some of which may be necessary prerequisites for a particular post-secondary program. For instance, without a tech teacher, there will be no tech program. With fewer teachers, class size will be larger, bringing new dynamics to the classroom that will detract from the learning environment. Split classes and multiple split classes are being explored and adopted in order to meet the new class size restrictions. Grade 9, 10, 11 classes in the same academic area could be combined into one class. This is always problematic as a teacher is divided between 2 or 3 classes and the student's needs at the same time. When you remove $1 billion from education, a reduction in the service delivery is all but inevitable. As mentioned before, the 4 compulsory e-learning credits will also be a shock to some students, where instead of having a regular class with a regular teacher, the course is conducted through a computer console. Extracurricular activities may suffer from the reduced funding, as teachers are unable to balance the increased workload and their volunteer time within the school. In decades past, each time the government attacked public education, it altered the dynamics within the school. Many teachers may not cope by declining to participate in extracurricular events and activities, not by choice, but due to the necessity. This is always a difficult decision, as some teachers that run these activities willingly give up their free time to provide these opportunities for students, but find with the increased workload, it becomes nearly impossible. There will be fewer teachers to deal with an increased workload. Student options, contact time will decrease. Despite the best efforts of all of our local education community, the students' educational experience will be negatively impacted by the decline in funding for teachers. The government is aware that the funding changes will create larger classes. In a CBC article posted on March 20th, Ontario Education Minister Lisa Thompson says increasing the average size of a high school class will benefit students across the province by making them more resilient. Thompson states, when students are currently preparing to go off to post-secondary education, we're hearing from the professors and employers alike that they are lacking coping skills and they are lacking resiliency. Thompson told CBC Radio's Metro Morning on Wednesday, by increasing the class size in high school, we are preparing them for the reality of post-secondary as well as the world of work. With all due respect to the Minister of Education, I completely disagree with her assertion about large classes. Keep going?
Sure.
Sure. All right.
You're on a roll.
What might be the community experience as a result of the service delivery impacts? There are short and long-term negative impacts. The short-term impacts include reduction number of teachers as well as the reduction in the options and opportunities for students, as I've already illustrated. The long-term impacts of reduced funding on public education carry a greater weight. The permanent reduction of teaching staff will have an economic ripple within the community. The elimination of well-paying jobs within our communities also reduce the amount of economic capital flowing through local businesses. For every dollar spent on wages, that translates to $1.30 in economic activity within the community. Combining all the eliminated positions within the school board in all panels, that would equate to about $1.5 million per year, plus inflation, permanently removed from our local economy. And there are further cuts proposed by the current government. With reduction in options for students, it will make attaining the requirements for graduation more difficult. With a reduction in staff, many educational experiences that help to define high school will be eliminated. Students will graduate with fewer educational experiences or may not graduate at all. There is a correlation between education and the use of social services such as EI and various healthcare services. Those that receive a better education are less likely to draw upon social services. Over time, the net result is that removing money from education today will actually cost the taxpayer much more money in the long run. That is why money put into education is an investment, not a cost. We all benefit from the strong publicly funded education system. To the local business owners who hire graduates from the Rainy River District School Board, basically, do you believe that cutting education will produce a better employee? The logical answer is no. With a reduction in educational funding, which is a reduction in investment in our youth, there will be a long-term social and economic impact that will unnecessarily hurt our community and our province as a whole. The $1 billion that the government removes from education today will cost future governments substantially more in the future. As I said earlier, the Ford government's educational funding cuts are myopic.
Thank you. So it sounds if I was like a northern student potentially living in a rural community, the impact may even be greater on me because the elective options I may wish to pursue don't have the same numbers to support them in this model, and I may not have access to the broadband I need to take my e-learning credits or something of that nature. I take that away from your comments.
Yes, in particular, Atikokan and Rainy River, they have been radically reduced staff. They're running 12 teachers, which can barely provide the programming needs. Hardly any electives, just to hit the requirements. So yes, it is, their educational experience will be curtailed.
Caroline, over to you.
For sure. To touch a little bit on your point about the e-learning courses, I believe when asked what would happen with kids who don't have access to broadband at home, the response was that they could go to the library. We, in years past, used to receive a grant covering our internet services through the Southern Ontario Library Service, and there's been no announcement as to what's going to happen with that funding. So, like you say, myopic. So what's going to happen to libraries? One of the things, like I've said before, that got a lot of the news was the change to interlibrary loan service. The province walked a little bit of that back, and they reestablished some rebates. One of the big changes, however, that they made was that the Southern Ontario Library Service was going to change how they did interlibrary loan. They used to do deliveries by van, and now they're changing to mirror the North's model. And I bring that up because I want to underline that the Southern Ontario Library Service was able to absorb the majority of their cut by changing their interlibrary loan service model. Not doing away with it, just changing the model to the Northern model. Obviously, we already used that model. We didn't have that ability, so the Ontario Library Service North had to dig a lot deeper for its cuts. That's why, because we're in the North, we're feeling this cut more than a Southern community would. That's the impact to our library. So for things like the reduction in ILS support hours, obviously checking books in and out, doing holds, searching the collection, these are all pretty fundamental parts of the library operation. If we experience a service outage, which we usually experience at least 1 or 2 a year, it's not going to be restored until the next working day. So what that means for us is that people won't be able to access certain services from home. We won't be able to perform many of the basic library operations. We have a workaround for checking books out, but we wouldn't be able to renew, place holds, check in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And recognizing that they went from a support team for the software of 4 people to 2. So the likelihood of receiving a service outage has also gone up. They've reduced, with their staff reductions, we've noticed already a reduction in response time once we reach out for professional development support. And then there's also the issue, because the South changed their interlibrary loan model, a number of their libraries have chosen to not begin participating in that service once more. That increases the burden on a lot of the northern libraries that have signed back up, and it also means that there's less services available. So many libraries like ours, what we've done locally is we've put a cap on the number of books that we're willing to lend out in order to be able to control costs and make sure that we're not bearing a bigger burden than what we had budgeted to bear.
Thank you. And I think that's an interesting example you raised, to the comparison between the southern and northern services, because I think it's one that's analogous to a lot of public sector service providers, in that you are not bloated bureaucracies in the north. You are offering services in efficient ways to cover a vast geography, using the internet, using Canada Post, being in 2 places at once as much as you can already. And so it is hard to find those, those economies of scale when you're already doing it.
And the frustrating thing for libraries was a lot of the talking points that the ministry and the province were putting out were inaccurate to the northern reality. They all focused on the south. They were putting out stuff like, there's vans crisscrossing the province delivering these books, and librarians in the north were saying, no, there's not. There's me bringing a box to Canada Post.
Thank you for that. Move down to Dan.
Thank you, and I just want to comment on the previous two speakers, the comment about the north being different, and it is different, and that's something I fight down south regularly. The north has already made many initiative changes, many things to make things more efficient, more cost-effective, and we do not run bloated budgets. Also, the illusion you've seen in the paper where money is being provided to municipal councils to go line by line through their budgets. Well, I'll tell you right now, our DSAB does that every year. I know our local councils do that every year. It's not something new and exciting that's going to save a ton of money. When you look at what is going to be the effect on our communities, the biggest thing I worry about is the decrease in service in outlying areas, in particularly our small rural areas and our TUMO areas. And I don't want to see a regionalization, and this is the way this government seems to be moving forward right now. You're seeing mega structures. The Ontario Health structure is a mega corporation with little to no say from the municipalities. It's all driven by government. As we move forward and they create their smaller entities in each region, the question is still how that governance model is going to move in. So we have a limited voice now, we have limited involvement, and we have this illusion that our little boards and committees that we run cost huge dollars. In the South, that's true. You can have a board member earning $100,000, a councillor earning $100,000. In the North, there's honorariums, maybe $2,000 to $3,000, a little bit more in larger communities. But it's not an apples to apples comparison when we get into that. Right now, we're seeing true chaos. We're seeing every aspect of service delivery in the province being attacked. And our concern is that we're going to lose small volunteer services. We're going to lose people that work in our communities and provide an income in the community as well, because you've got to look at the funding that those people get. So their annual salary is probably turned over about 7 times in that local community. So when you start pulling a job out of a community, you lose in the whole community, and the rest of your infrastructure suffers as well. The other thing we're looking at, people in the rural areas are going to have to travel farther for services. We already know one of the biggest issues in our district is the lack of public transit. We have to rely on friends, family, neighbors to move people around. Otherwise, we're stuck, or we don't get the care or the needs fulfilled that we need. Similarly, we're seeing other structures in this government. So right now, there's a regional review going on in the South, and they're looking at taking possibly 82 municipalities and turning them into 5 or 6 regional governments. They're also conducting a DSAB review right now, which is 10 DSABs. They haven't said anything about amalgamation. Right now, they're just focused on the funding. But we're just wondering, is that going to lead to another forced amalgamation of small municipalities? Again, under the guise of you can save more money. Well, we know, we looked across in our service, for example, ambulance, and you could not reduce the staffing levels to accommodate any cuts and maintain the same service delivery, even at the management levels. If you created a larger entity, you would still need a body in that seat. It might be a little bit cheaper body, but it is not going to save a ton of money. We know there's this failure to see the integration of services. In our office, we run an integrated service model. We have caseworkers that'll deal with childcare, Ontario Works, and social housing at the front door. You don't see that in the South, where there you see an individual doing one specific task. So as we move forward, we really got to look at what services we have. I think that our counselors and my board members are going to have some really difficult choices in the future, because it's strictly going to come down to a question of money and the service delivery, and where do you pay the piper. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. I think it's a really interesting comment too about the regionalization that we're seeing and what that means in the south versus up here, where we become a very distant spoke on a very large center typically when that happens, and whether that makes sense for the type of service that's being delivered. So it's an important concept. Trudy, over to you.
Thanks, Doug. We've already seen some impacts to services here in our community because of the changes that have been made. We've had 2 vacancies in Kenora, so we've had 2 vacant lawyer positions, and we've been unable to fill them. But what that means is that folks who work in the Fort Francis office are having to cover work and deal with clients who are in Kenora, which then means that if you come to the door in Fort Francis, it's far more likely that we're going to have to say, I'm sorry, we don't have the resources to help you right now, because we are covering a larger geography and a larger client base with fewer people. Right now, the direction we have is that we are not allowed to make commitments past March 31st of next year, because that's all tied to the review date. So how do you fill a position when all you can do is contract with someone for a number of months? It's not an easy thing to do, which again will impact on services here locally. The other impact that I see looming is the lack of local decision-making. Issues that are faced by folks of low income in Toronto are very different than the issues that people in Fort Francis might have. A number of times through the years, people have said to me, well, there's no homelessness in Fort Francis. Well, there is, it just doesn't look the same as it does in other communities. People are couch surfing, people are living rough in the summertime, but then they move on in the winter. And we've been able at the clinic to allocate our resources to help work with that and deal with that. And if we lose our community board, if we become, as Dan was referring, part of a mega organization, which is one of the things that's being floated out there with this review that's going on, we could lose the ability to make decisions that are appropriate to our community. The other piece of that that's really, really disheartening is if that happens, what will happen to the work we've done with our Indigenous communities and our Indigenous clients? Because folks who live on a First Nation in our district have very different perspectives and very different needs than people who may be Indigenous but living in downtown Toronto. So I fear that we would lose the ability to appropriately help folks who are within our catchment area.
Thank you. Christy, based on the comments you heard from the 4 panelists, is there something from the CMHA's space that you think is an important reflection for people to take away?
Absolutely. The proposed budget cuts to Legal Aid Ontario will have a devastating impact on Legal Ontario's ability to provide legal services to Ontario's most vulnerable sector. CMHA Fort Francis relies on the Northwest Community Legal Clinic on a day-to-day basis to assist and ensure that our clients receive and maintain income and advocate for other benefits that they're entitled to, such as ODSP and OW, and that they remain housed through Landlord and Tenancy Acts. The Northwestern Legal Clinic is an extension of our health team, and it is there to maximize the health of our vulnerable and most marginalized clients. With the public library, we were talking earlier, Caroline and I, the public library isn't what it used to be. Back in my day, check out a book, go there. The public library has become a shelter. It's become a safe place for our clients to go, to use technology, to access the service or the forums that they're needed for government. So that's changing, and they need that safe place to go and be able to feel safe, socialize, and be a part of the community. So the loss of the services may result in an already vulnerable sector feeling more stress, angry, anxiety, and uncertainty that results in the impact of clients' well-being and their mental health.
Thank you. And just for anyone who is here or maybe watching, and when we talk about the vulnerable sector, what are we typically referring to?
low income, homeless. That's our vulnerable sector. 18 years,
People in those equity-seeking groups.
absolutely.
So let's jump ahead to question 4, and this is really our last question on the sort of the formal roster here. And this question asks our service providers how they're going to respond to the cuts and what their organizations are doing. Hopefully we can keep each of these responses maybe tight to a couple minutes, and then that way we'll have time if there are any questions from our attendees today, and then we'll wrap things up after that. So, Kent?
So I'm here to motivate you. So that's part of my response. Public sector jobs have value. To make a bold statement and say to all public sector groups that you will be cut by 4% is ridiculous. To say $6 billion will be cut is outlandish. These numbers just don't reflect the true nature of the work of the greater public sector. To remove $1 billion from education is very short-sighted. Candidate Ford stated he would find efficiencies and nobody would lose their job. Well, we know that's not true. I would encourage you to call Doug Ford out on his ham-fisted economic solutions. I would also encourage you to contact our MPP. It is the job of our MPP to represent us. Let him know that by participating in a process of cuts to our public sector, he is hurting our community. Investment in education and well-paying jobs should be a priority in our district. As a labor union, Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation has been and will continue to work with other teacher labor groups and other public sector labor organizations to push back against the Ford government's cuts. I would also encourage the local media to get involved and cover the decline in education funding as an important local news story. By the way, 40 secondary classes will be slashed because of the funding shortfall. Just as a comparator, Rainy River next year is running 54 sections, and 40 will be cut across the board. Where is that? Tomorrow, the Conference Board of Canada will release a report called The Economic Case for Investing in Education. The release will take place at the Empire Club of Canada early tomorrow afternoon. I feel confident that many of the issues I have raised this evening will be echoed in this report. As a teacher, I will use this opportunity as a teachable moment to pass along an important message. Doug Ford's reduction in education funding of $1 billion will have a negative effect on our province by targeting our schools, our teachers, our students. That's not finding efficiencies, that's attacking public education.
Thank you for that. I think it's an important message too, I think for a lot of young people going through those formative stages, not knowing what gifts they have because the places to find them aren't available is a big problem. So I'll turn that over to Caroline next.
Sure. So in terms of locally, we're doing what we can to prepare in the event of any service outages. So creating processes and procedures for announcing if we're not able to operate. We've been told what we cannot do. So for instance, a lot of the concern in public libraries around the province is that we're going to have to be now paying more for interlibrary loan. So a question was asked of the ministry, are we able to pass along costs related to mailing books, which is very much reduced. Canada Post offers a wonderful book rate to us, so it only costs like $1.38 per book to send. And the ministry directive was no. This is within one of the regulations of the Public Libraries Act. You are not allowed to charge for books of any kind, even if there is processing costs associated with them. One thing that I've done along with 2 other Northwestern librarians is we've met with Minister Rickford and we talked to him about what the impact to the north is, what the impact to his constituents is, and we really tried to impress upon him something that I think all of us have really touched on, which is that the north is different than the south, and the realities of the south and the realities of the north are incredibly different, and we are being hit by these funding cuts far more and disproportionately than southern counterparts.
Thank you for that. Dan?
Thank you. So for us, we're trying to get more and more involved as the province sets up different consultation tables, we try to work very closely to get on those tables and have representatives from the north. We work, of course, with the Association of Municipalities of Ontario. I'm currently the president of the Ontario Municipal Association of Social Services for Ontario, and I'm also the second vice president of the Ontario Paramedic Chiefs. And we're at the tables, we're getting our message across. The question is getting it listened to. And that's where we need the public's involvement and people to talk to their local MPP to show what the effect of that change is going to be. As we move forward, we're looking at things like how do we protect our services? So you heard me speak earlier of the Ontario Health Team proposal. We have over 35 agencies that signed off on the proposal in less than 2 weeks. And there's probably another 35 that are willing to sign already. But when you look at something like that, just the geographic area we're talking about covering, Thunder Bay District, Kenora District, and the Rainy River District, how do you set up the structure? How do you get the voice across the unit? The other thing we're working on is Employment Ontario. I didn't speak about that earlier, but the province has announced they want to go to either a for-profit model, a public service model. They've basically opened it up to a system that has been delivered for years through the local agencies. And they're again looking at, oh, well, we can save money by rolling all these agencies together. So 9 of the DSABs, there's 10 in the province, have gotten together, and we've said we'll take the money because one of the goals of this province is to have one transfer payment for each program. So we said we'll take the money, we'll do the contracts with the individual agencies and protect our local agencies. We're waiting to see what the announcement is on that. We continue to monitor the information, but there's a lot of things going on. Some things you may have seen sort of in the background and not clearly understood is technology. This province is pushing to move all to technology solutions. Well, we know in the north we do not have the technology supports. Small communities still have poor internet streaming. People don't have access to computers. People don't have access to the internet. So if you're going to make that the venue for getting your service, it's going to fail miserably in the north. The second thing that's going to take away from us is procurement. Right now, the province is talking about going to a major centralized procurement model. And when you think about each of your agencies and what you purchase locally, what are you going to lose in your community if you're not purchasing local services? If all of a sudden that shipment is coming from Toronto. So a lot of questions about where we're going to go. All I can say is if you're asked to sit on a committee or a board with the province, please do so and make sure you bring our northern message across. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Trudy.
So we're here tonight. That's part of what the legal clinic is doing. We, like the DSAB, are trying to stay involved provincially because it's a bigger fight than just our community. However, it starts in our communities, and we have to make that happen. We have to make people in our community understand. So we have tried to give our clients a voice. I know here tonight we've got some postcards. We've been getting people to do postcards to try and get that message from clients who might not otherwise have an opportunity to speak up. We too are asking people to talk to our local MPP to make sure that our MPP understands what's important in our community and that decisions to take away services won't result in quiet response, that if services are removed from our community, that people are going to speak up, people are going to push back, particularly for the legal aid service issues. I haven't even gotten into it at all. Legal aid certificate issues have changed. There is no longer coverage for certificates for bail hearings, so there can be a lot of loss in other areas of our community in the justice sector. So we are trying to encourage people to get out there to share that message, to share the message in the media. Our media has been wonderful in our district, to share the message with the Attorney General. If the cabinet happens to shuffle and change, to share the message with whoever is the Attorney General after that change. The biggest thing for us is not to make it just a one-moment comment, a one-time issue. Because for legal clinics during this review over the next few months, if people don't speak up for community clinics and keeping the clinic in the community, I fear we'll be gone.
Thank you, Trudy. And just for those in attendance and viewers, the town of Fort Frances did pass a support resolution for the clinic, and some of the information that Trudy shared tonight is reflected in that, and also for the library. The Northwestern Health Unit is unfortunately not here tonight, but we've also heard from them, and there's been a lot of commentary on some of those public health issues as well. And I think what's important to those three areas, and you touched on it a bit, is the idea that if any of us feel a nagging compulsion to care about these concerns, chances are there's someone in our community who has far more reliance on them than we do that needs us to speak up, because the impact on them is far greater. And I think that's something that people need to internalize and take home with them from this session. Christy, any final thoughts on this topic?
So I think I would like people to remember that one legal problem can lead to a downward spiral of legal troubles, which can be very difficult to overcome. As a result, any cuts to services will have a devastating impact on the lives of low-income individuals within the Northwest who depend on those services. CMHA Fort Frances branch will continue to work with our community partners on a day-to-day basis and support in any way that we can.
So with that, we have a handful of folks here in the gallery, and I just wanted to make this a bit more participatory. And if anyone did have a question or comment, I'm not going to bother with the mic at the podium because it never works, but the ones on the table are wired up, so please come on down. Just so it's captured for Shaw on the video.
June Call, Mayor, in case anybody here doesn't recognize me through all the newspapers I've been in lately. My common denominator in every person's comments from the panel tonight, there's one common denominator that I can see most of all, and that is the vulnerability of children in every single aspect that you are talking about. It all comes down to, are children going to be raised by parents who can afford to feed them and can afford to send them to school, whose parents hopefully don't have mental health issues because of all they're dealing with in life. Now we're coming at it, to me, sort of like in different silos, and I'd like to see all of you together come up with a common denominator so that you are working together for that common denominator. And the most vulnerable people are the ones who can't speak for themselves, and those are the children, and those are the poor. Those are the people with mental health issues. So you all are touching on that as far as I'm concerned, but if we collectively come together to the government and say, you know what, with the cuts to DSAB and with the cuts that you're giving to the schools and the cuts you're giving to legal aid and to the library and so on, these are the people that you are impacting most of all, our most vulnerable residents of our area, and we need to protect them by working together. Because, and I always think of kids, of course, because I'm a retired teacher, and I remember my very first school class, I was teaching grade 4, this was 1971, I had 35 children. Now we've gone backwards to 1971 with, as far as the number that they expect teachers to look after. And when I look at it from a public teacher perspective, you have so much of a variety of children in there. You have your learning disabled children, and there's not enough people to look after them and help them. Not to say the society that we have nowadays with the issues that society has, the discipline problems that come into the school system that you try to deal with to even teach the ones who want to learn. But it all still stems back to all of you. That happens because of issues that you can't help them with because you haven't got the funding, and it's getting worse and worse. So that's my suggestion. Work together. Rather than your single pods and sending letters, send some letters all together, and send petitions or whatever that you can get from the public here even, and push that way.
Thank you, Mayor June. I don't know if anyone wants to take that. I do know that the Association of Community Legal Clinics has a pretty, they're coordinating internally to their sector. I know the Northern Librarians are very tight and have been coordinating their efforts. And I know Labor obviously has a very strong tradition of working across organizations, but I think that's a good comment. Does anyone want to respond to what June suggested? I know there's
Briefly,
collaboration
yeah.
within the sectors, but not necessarily between them, but maybe somebody has a reflection on that.
No, I'd like to respond to that at least briefly, just to say that here we are tonight, and we are all together. There isn't anybody at this table that didn't work a full day today with trying to figure out how to help the folks that we deal with. And also kudos to the counselors who've come out tonight as well, that we didn't have any problems getting people to come tonight and putting this together. And I think that's a really good suggestion that, we're all here and there are ways that we can work together for our community. And I think you see the willingness to do it by everybody being here.
Okay. All yours.
Hi, I'm Andrew Hallekas, a counselor, but also library board member. Sometimes the Premier and his ministers make my head hurt. When Kent told me about the Minister of Education saying that larger classes will make students more resilient, I thought of George Orwell's book 1984 in Truth Speak and Double Speak. And I had an experience with that involving libraries. 3 times our local MP, Minister Rickford, was asked about the cuts to funding Ontario library services. Once in Kenora, once here, and I asked the question again once at Noma and Thunder Bay. So the question was specifically about the cuts to funding library services. And Caroline, I want you to help me with this. His response, and also the response of the Minister of Culture when he was asked, and the Minister of Housing when he was asked, was to say that the base funding for libraries hasn't been cut. Caroline, does the base funding for libraries have anything to do with Ontario Library Services?
No, and the cuts to Ontario Library Services means that our base funding doesn't go as far as it otherwise would, because we lost programs that helped us find budget efficiencies.
So that made my head hurt. And then, again, everybody loves libraries. We all love libraries. And there was a fair bit of pushback when there was a 50% cut to both northern and southern library services. And the public got involved, librarians got involved, our library got involved. And the government started to feel some of that heat. And they seem to focus on interlibrary loans. Mm-hmm. And so, to some extent, I think interlibrary loans have been restored. But there's little or no new money with that. It just got a little bit of publicity to make the government look like they were backing off. But library services were cut by 50%. And so my understanding, Caroline, is that Ontario Library Services provide a wide variety and a great deal of depth in the services that they provide to individual libraries, particularly smaller libraries and First Nation libraries. So does, in some way, restoring the interlibrary loan service, does that in any way reverse the cuts to Ontario Library Services?
No.
And
The rebate that the North offered is like $21,000 spread over the entire North. It's not significant.
And just my final point, again, is, so Ontario Library Services, they provide a lot of services to libraries, and as I mentioned, First Nation libraries and smaller libraries. And so, if these libraries want to keep operating and provide the same services that they're doing now, but without the assistance of Ontario Library Services North, will they require extra funding to do that?
Likely. I think one thing that we're shielded from in this community because of our size is that I have a master's degree in library services. I have an educational background that a lot of small community libraries don't have. They have librarians that don't have master's degrees that are operating libraries for their community on, say, maybe only 15 hours a week, 20 hours a week. And they rely on Ontario Library Service North for professional development help that is offered free of charge. And one thing that we heard from a small community library was, we don't have the budget to hire a professional librarian. We rely on Ontario Library Service North for professional librarian advice. So if their capacity to offer that advice is halved, there's not really a lot of other options where someone's going to give you something for free.
And so that's my fear, and as much as Dan said earlier, he worries about cuts in funding, yet still has to provide the same services. And then that, of course, can reflect on the municipalities. And as a municipal councillor, and speaking for municipal councillors everywhere in Ontario where there are libraries, the majority of the funding for public libraries comes from the municipality. The province puts in a very small percentage of the funding. And so if these libraries don't want to cut programs, then they're going to have to go back to already stretched northern municipalities and look for more money. And as, again, Dan said, we're pretty lean up here, and we're pretty careful with our budgets, and there's only one taxpayer. So as I said, the Premier and his ministers, they make my head hurt.
Come on down. Else you can yell really loud.
I'd rather not.
Okay.
I get enough downtime. I feel badly because as the third speaker, the third questioner, we're all three councillors here. We're occupying all the time here, so I apologize to everybody for that. But a very quick question, no oration, just a very quick question, Mr. Kowalski. Obviously, you'd have to get the permission of those 7 people you named, but have you considered sending a letter to Redford saying giving the names of those 7 people, these are the 7 people that have lost their job in Fort Frances and Rainy River District. What are you going to say to them? What are you going to do for them? So they know that there are 7 people that have lost their jobs.
Originally, I'll get a little technical in the formatting. So the government in mid-March said we were cutting education to a certain amount, and that we kind of worked out what that would be. But there's something referred to as the technical paper, which has all the numbers to say exactly what it means, translates into staff. Well, that only came out a few weeks ago. But of course, all the boards have to say, well, how many staff are we carrying? We have to guess. Originally, that number was 12 people out of work. So 12 people redundant and 5 people surplus, which means they had to go to one of the other schools for a job. I went into Mr. Rickford's office, lined with all this information, to give him a list of the 12 people and the 5 that were surplus. And he, of course, wasn't available for a meeting. That was some time ago. I had a conversation. This one's kind of, the timing was impeccable. While I was waiting to talk to somebody there, the phone rang and he answered it and went on at great length how nobody was losing their job. And as he hung up the phone, I said, you should call them back because, and I listed everything. I said, by the way, I'd like to see the MPP. Well, that was some time ago and I haven't been able to get in to see him. So yes, I'm prepared to go in and explain all of this to him and to prove undoubtedly that people are losing their job here. And for what reason? some philosophical stance, some ideological stance about why education needs to be cut, why all public service needs to be cut, is just absurd. And so to push back against that.
Those names would have an impact.
I'm ready to go.
Real people.
That's why I listed them here this evening. They are the real people that are losing their job.
See someone coming down?
I don't have that big voice. I just look at them in the classroom. My name is Joanne Formanek Gustafson, and I'm an occasional teacher in the area. I've been teaching for about 8 years, and I've been following a lot of the funding cuts quite closely. I'm fairly vocal on social media because I really feel that it's clear that the people who are going to suffer most really are most vulnerable, people who don't really have sometimes the capacity and other times the supports to help themselves. Plainly, that's really who's at risk here. I think I love the idea of you encouraging people to contact MPPs and contact the Premier's office. Really, I guess what I'm wondering, two things. Interesting to know that you haven't been able to meet with Mr. Bickford. I know quite a few people have tried to, or I should say MPP in this capacity. Have you been able to meet with him, Mr. McCormick?
Yes.
No? No. Okay, and I know that several teacher union presidents in the area also weren't able to even get a call back from his office, so that one is pretty clear. In terms of who they would contact, people would contact, Minister of Education and the Premier, that one's pretty clear. Libraries are funded through culture, tourism, and recreation. Is it?
Culture, tourism, and sport.
Culture, tourism, they change the names and I
Yeah.
can never keep track. DSAB,
Yeah, we have several ministries, so Ministry of Community and Social Services, Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, Ministry of Health, obviously, and what would be the last one? Ministry of Education.
education, how does education factor into your funding?
We run childcare, so the comments about the continuity of care starts with our program, so.
Okay, yeah, and that was a sort of a sore point in education funding, that money had been put in there, identified as education, to say that we don't have any cuts. $400 million has been added. That's really not for, the public education system. Attorney General's office,
Yes, Ministry of the Attorney General.
Ministry of Attorney General.
EAG herself.
We would be any of the already mentioned names,
All of the above.
all of the above.
All of the above, okay. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joanne. Any other comments or questions from folks who are here? No? Okay. So I have one more question for the panelists, so I'll get Aaron to just pan ahead on that. And maybe we will start the other way with Christy or Trudy, whoever wants to take the bait. And this one is for you. So tomorrow morning when you get to work, the phone rings and it is Premier Ford. And he would like to know, because you're a frontline person in your sector, where he could find money to save. Where would you direct him to look? This is a G rating, so please.
Okay, I'm presuming I'm answering the phone.
It's not a role play. You can just give.
For me, the answer is to consult with the folks who are delivering the services. A big part of the challenge of what's gone on here is that there hasn't been any genuine consultation with clinics and with the folks who are delivering the services. And there has just been cut and direction from MAG as to what we're supposed to do. Because if there is a need for savings, then if you let the folks who are delivering the services have a say in what's going to happen, and we have a genuine target that's not just an arbitrary number to support different programs and plans, but if we're given a genuine target, if someone were to consult with us and instead of imposing something that was retroactive, I would say, please talk to us, let us see what we can do, and we will come back to you, because we hopefully can come up with plans that will have the least impact on client service. And the folks, as in the other folks sitting at the table, I think we all have the best idea of what we could do to preserve the services in our community versus things being imposed on us from above. So I'd ask for a call back in a couple weeks.
Dan?
Head to head, eh? Okay. I guess my first thing is use data that means something. This government has based a lot of its decisions on false or inaccurate data, and I would speak for all of our agencies. I think we're very rich in data, and we can show you the numbers to substantiate different business cases. But the other thing, I think, the North is a model in many ways as well. We have done things that could be mirrored in the South that aren't mirrored in the South, and perhaps they should be. And there's always something you can adjust or cut, but it's a question of what is the basket of services that you need to be left with in each community. And that's something this province seems to have lost sight of. There has to be something that we can expect when we live in a certain geographic area.
Some more recognition of North as a best practice because we're already doing some of these things. But I think probably in the DSAB context too, you are more acutely attuned to the whack-a-mole of public services in that if I bang this one down,
I've got a very short neck now.
that one's going to go up. And I presume that would probably factor into your conversation too.
Very much so, and we've also got to look at the numerous programs that we're running, and we're running them basically on the behalf of the municipalities. So we've always got to be cognizant of what their wishes are, and that's why we are so closely allied with AMO.
Caroline?
Dan took a lot of what I was going to say, which is that, you know, the North has been doing the same or more with less for years. Our populations are shrinking, unlike the South, so we've been making these efficiencies and making these decisions for a long time. And one thing that's already worked in the library sector is the adoption of a northern practice in the South. So why not kind of continue some of those trends and look at best practices that exist in the province, but also exist elsewhere? And like Trudy said, take a logical, well-planned approach, not a retroactive approach, not an approach where they just seem to pull a number that doesn't correlate to any of the other data that we can look at, and, you know, take their time, because you don't find efficiencies 4 months into the budget year.
For sure. Over to you.
Okay, well, I have two, seeing that my first answer he's not going to like. So I'll have. So my first one is I would challenge the premise of the question saying, well, why do you need cost savings? What are you doing? It's simple. There's money coming in, money going out. If you're cutting all this, what are you going to spend it on? And so what is more important than everything we've just listed here? So I would challenge them to say, you don't have to make any cost savings. Work within what you have. These are all valuable positions. This is the greater public sector. We provide a service that is valuable, and work with it. He's not going to go for that. So plan B, and I would say more specifically to the education sector, I go cost savings. And I would say education isn't a cost, it's an investment. And what you put in pays dividends down the road for all of us. And to look at it as a cost is a very foolish, myopic view of education. And it's obvious from what has happened for many of these agencies that he has very little respect and very little understanding of the greater public sector, in particular education, when they go and make these kind of, again, I may use the term, ham-fisted economic policies.
All right, so we have a few minutes. I don't know if there's any final comment or burning thought anyone wants to share that didn't come up earlier before we wrap things up. Go ahead, Dan.
I guess one thing I've heard from several of the panelists now, and that's the effect of downstream costs. And I don't know how we could ever quantify it, but when I look at children's services and then going through the education system, and then I look at housing and homelessness and the effects that, I look at mental health. Everything is so tied together, and we have to make the investments now to make sure that we cut our expenses later. And that's something, I don't know how we quantify it, but that's something we've got to work on. Thank you.
Anyone else? No? All right, so with that, that brings us to the end of our event. Thank you again to everyone that took part here tonight. For those that may be watching from elsewhere, thank you especially to Aaron for enlisting and enforcing our panelists' attendance tonight, and also to the clinic for putting on this event. We're hosted by the town of Fort Francis. It's great to see Councillors Hallekas and Wiedenhoff here, as well as Mayor Call. And thank you to Shaw for streaming and recording this. And I see that we have some other media present. So with that, we'll bid you all good night, and we'll be here for a few minutes if anyone wants to chit-chat or gossip about any of the subject matter. Thanks.
Thank you.